The first lie hit the courtroom before the clerk even finished calling the case. The man in the ivory suit leaned back like he owned the building, smiled at the cameras, and said, "That house is mine until I decide otherwise." Then he slid a stack of bankruptcy filings across the table with a manicured hand and added, loud enough for the gallery to hear, "If Judge Caprio thinks he can move me, he can come drag me out himself." A gasp cracked through the room. Someone whispered, "Did he really just say that?" Under the cold wash of courthouse lights, with the marble walls holding every breath like a secret, it felt as if everybody present understood the same thing at once. This was no routine eviction hearing. This was the moment a professional parasite had finally strutted into the one courtroom where theater stopped working. Judge Caprio didn't react the way arrogant men expect powerful people to react. He didn't bark. He didn't posture. Calm. He didn't meet disrespect with noise. He simply looked over his glasses, folded his hands, and let the silence build until it pressed against the defendant's grin like a weight. It was a legendary kind of stillness, the kind that made liars hear their own heartbeat. If you've ever watched a bully confuse delay with weakness, if you've ever seen someone mistake law for a costume they could mock, stay with this story and tell me in the comments the exact moment you knew this man was finished, because Judge Caprio was about to do what cameras love and arrogance fears most. He was about to let the truth walk in slowly, close every exit, and shut it all down. At the center of the case was a woman who looked like she had spent her whole life apologizing for taking up space she had every right to stand in. Eleanor Whitmore sat in the front row with her back very straight, both gloved hands clasped around an old leather folder worn pale at the edges. She was 71, silver-haired, dignified, and tired in the way only real betrayal makes people tired. Her late husband had built a successful architectural firm, and the mansion at issue, a sprawling stone estate at the edge of town, had been in the family for decades. To the internet, to gossip channels, to people who saw only the word mansion, she looked rich, but the reality was uglier and much more human. Taxes, legal fees, medical bills from her husband's long illness, and the maintenance of a crumbling historic property had drained nearly everything. She was living in 2 restored rooms off the kitchen, selling heirlooms one by one to keep the estate afloat, while trying to legally remove a man who had turned the rest of her home into a fortress of fraud. That man was Victor Hale, and Victor Hale wore entitlement the way some men wear cologne. It arrived before he spoke. His ivory suit was razor-cut, his shoes shined like mirrors, his pocket square folded with predatory precision. He sat with one ankle on one knee, chin lifted, mouth curled in a smile that never reached his eyes. He called himself a housing rights consultant. The city records called him an unauthorized occupant. Eleanor called him what he was the first time she ever found the courage to say it aloud in public. A man who saw grief and moved into it. His original story had sounded almost harmless. He had claimed there was an agreement, an informal caretaker arrangement with Eleanor's nephew while the estate sorted probate paperwork. Then came the first excuse, then the second, then the first emergency filing. Each time the sheriff scheduled an eviction, a new bankruptcy petition appeared hours before lockout. Different case numbers, different debt lists, different variations of Victor's own name. Victor Hale, V. Hale, Victor A. Hale, Victor Allen Hales. The paperwork was just real enough to stall the process and just false enough to collapse later, after the delay had already done its work. Weeks became months. Months became nearly 2 years. In that time, Eleanor watched strangers host parties in her ballroom, smoke on her terrace, break antique railings, drain the pool dry, and film social media videos calling the estate liberated property. She stayed quiet because quiet was cheaper than lawyers, until quiet became the very thing that nearly cost her everything. The first twist came disguised as boredom. Victor's attorney, sleek and impatient, framed it as a dry procedural matter. Technical stays, clerical confusion, misunderstandings in filing sequence. Victor even yawned while they spoke. Then Judge Caprio asked one question in that soft, devastating tone of his. "How many bankruptcies has your client filed in 18 months? The attorney answered, 3, Your Honor. Caprio didn't look down at the file. He looked straight at Victor. "That is not what I asked." The courtroom went silent. The clerk handed up a supplemental packet. Caprio flipped one page, then another, and the air changed. I count 7 attempted filings, 4 dismissed for material falsehoods, 1 rejected for forged signature blocks, and 2 using addresses belonging to properties your client does not own. A whisper rippled through the gallery like dry leaves. Victor's smile tightened. That was the first crack. Eleanor was called, and when she stood, she looked fragile until she started speaking. Then something else came through. Not loudness, not drama, strength. She described finding Victor in the West Wing 2 days after her husband's memorial, claiming he had permission to stabilize occupancy. She described the first time he blocked a locksmith at the front doors. The first time he laughed when she begged him not to use her husband's study. The first time she found a bankruptcy notice taped to a bronze lamp in the entry hall, as if the law itself were now part of the vandalism. Her voice shook only once, when she spoke about the nursery upstairs that had belonged to the daughter she lost decades ago. He rented it for video shoots, she said. He put colored lights in that room. The courtroom made a sound then, a low collective ache. Victor rolled his eyes, drummed his fingers on the table, and muttered into a live microphone, "People cry when they're out of options." Heads turned. Eleanor did not. She just stood there under the fluorescent glare, her blue wool coat buttoned to the throat, grief in her face and steel in her spine, and somehow he looked smaller for having mocked her. That's when everything changed. Judge Caprio admitted the exhibit nobody expected to matter much, CCTV footage from inside the mansion. Eleanor's late husband had installed a private archival security system years earlier, not for crime, but to monitor restoration crews working around historic interiors. Victor's side had insisted the footage was irrelevant. Caprio disagreed. On the screen, the mansion appeared as it truly was, not glamorous, but haunted by neglect. Dust in the sunlight, covered furniture, long corridors echoing with emptiness. Then Victor appeared, not as a tenant or caretaker, but as a director staging a conquest. In one clip, he instructed 2 men to carry Eleanor's family portraits into storage where the old lady can't use them for sympathy. In another, he stood in the library with a laptop open, dictating what sounded like a script. Use the Nevada filing first, then the emergency petition. If the judge signs off, pivot to federal stay language. Spell my name different. They almost never check fast enough. The room erupted in whispers. Victor turned red and whispered furiously to his attorney. Judge Caprio didn't blink. The next reveal was worse. Phone records tied Victor to a document preparer already under investigation for fraudulent bankruptcy petitions. Text messages showed him coaching other squatters in other high-value properties. One message read, "Old houses, older owners, fastest leverage." Another read, "Make the paperwork messy and the sheriffs freeze." But the message that poisoned the room completely was the one sent just 5 nights before the hearing. "Caprio is sentimental. Put the widow on camera and he'll try to look noble. Doesn't matter. Delay is profit." Even Victor's own attorney seemed to flinch when the text was read aloud. The courtroom went dead silent. Victor lifted his chin and tried one last performance. He laughed, actually laughed. "This is America," he said. "If she's too weak to hold her property, somebody stronger takes it. That's not fraud. That's reality." You could feel the energy of the room harden. Even the fluorescent hum seemed sharper. A deputy near the door shifted his stance. The stenographer paused half a breath before typing again. Eleanor shut her eyes, inhaled once, and opened them with a steadiness that was almost painful to witness. Judge Caprio took off his glasses and set them down. He leaned forward very slightly. "No, Mr. Hale," he said, and every syllable landed clean as stone. "That is not reality. That is the speech of a scavenger who mistakes another person's exhaustion for permission." A gasp rose from the gallery. Somebody whispered, "Wow." Victor's face changed. Not all at once. Arrogance never leaves gracefully, but it changed. The little grin disappeared. The jaw set too hard. Sweat shone faintly at his temple, and still he kept pushing. He accused the court of bias. He called the filings creative strategy. He sneered that Eleanor was using vintage tears in a fancy zip code. Then he crossed the line. He pointed toward the bench and said, "With all due respect, Judge, you're reading morality into a property game you clearly don't understand." The courtroom went silent again. So suddenly it felt orchestrated. Judge Caprio looked at him for a long moment that seemed to stretch and stretch until Victor could no longer hide inside his own voice. When Caprio finally spoke, it was with the calm of a man who had heard every excuse cowardice ever invented and found them all dull. He said the court understood exactly what this was. Not tenancy, not hardship, not procedural confusion. It was a calculated abuse of federal bankruptcy protections to obstruct lawful process, intimidate an elderly homeowner, and monetize delay. He said the law exists to shield the vulnerable from power, not to hand predators a stack of paper and call it ingenuity. Then his voice got quieter, which somehow made it devastating. You did not occupy a mansion, Mr. Hale. You occupied a widow's grief. You draped yourself in legal language because theft sounds vulgar in its natural form. Victor opened his mouth, but Caprio raised one finger and stopped him cold. And let me make this unforgettable for you. A forged filing is not a fortress. It is a confession with staples. The line hit like a blast wave. There it was, the viral one-liner, the sentence everyone in that room knew would be repeated long after the hearing ended. But Judge Caprio wasn't done. His late script monologue came down not as anger, but as judgment stripped to its moral core. He said there is a particular ugliness in exploiting systems designed to help people in genuine financial collapse, and an even deeper ugliness in weaponizing those systems against a grieving older woman fighting to stay in the home where her life had happened. He said privilege often announces itself not through inheritance or square footage, but through a man's belief that consequences are for other people. He said Victor Hale had confused delay with victory, technicality with innocence, and charm with character. This court is not impressed by your tailoring, your rehearsed contempt, or the volume of your confidence, he said. The law sees through costume, and today, so does everyone else. By then, Victor was no longer arrogant. He was defensive, flushed, twitching, whispering frantically to counsel, his shoulders climbing toward his ears. Collapse had entered the room and taken his seat. Judge Caprio ordered the immediate dismissal of the latest bankruptcy stay as bad faith and fraudulent on its face. He referred the matter for criminal investigation into bankruptcy fraud, forgery, false filings, and unlawful occupancy. He authorized immediate enforcement of the eviction with supervised removal and asset documentation to preserve evidence of damage to the estate. He awarded Eleanor possession, expedited relief, and sanctions tied to the abusive filing pattern. But the most satisfying blow was the one that wasn't merely procedural. Caprio looked directly at Eleanor and told her gently, Mrs. Whitmore, this court sees what was taken from you, and it will not call it strategy. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth. Tears spilled, but there was relief in them now, and vindication, and the strange trembling that comes when a person has been forced to be strong for too long and is finally allowed to stop. Victor tried one last protest as deputies moved toward him. You can't do this over paperwork. Judge Caprio's answer came instantly. I'm not doing this over paperwork. I'm doing this because the paperwork proved who you are. The gallery broke into whispers so intense they sounded like rain. Victor's face seemed to cave inward, all the polish suddenly looking theatrical and cheap. He had entered like a man strolling through someone else's house. He left looking like a trespasser in his own skin. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects spread fast. Other property owners came forward. More filings were examined, names connected, schemes unraveled. The mansion was secured, restored room by room, and Eleanor opened part of the estate months later for a historic preservation fundraiser in her husband's name. People who had watched the hearing showed up just to shake her hand. She stood in the doorway in a navy dress, shoulders back, no longer looking like a woman apologizing for surviving. As for Victor, the cameras that once fed his ego recorded something else entirely now. A man learning too late that the law he mocked had a memory, and that Judge Caprio had given it a voice nobody could ignore. So if you've ever seen cruelty dress itself up as confidence, if you've ever watched someone try to bury decency under paperwork and pressure and call it intelligence, remember this courtroom. Remember that dead silent moment. Remember the judge who saw through the costume and shut it all down. Justice doesn't always arrive fast, but when it arrives clear, calm, and undeniable, it changes the whole room. If this story moved you, if you felt that verdict in your chest, Tell me what moment hit hardest in the comments. Like this video, subscribe for more stories where arrogance meets its ending, and share this with someone who needs to remember that no matter how grand the house or how polished the lie, the truth still knows how to open the front door.